Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We're really excited to have you here. This is the first of four events in a series that we're calling Visions of Change, a series of racial justice in American law. These are extraordinary times. The brutal death of George Floyd at the hands of the police has prompted a long overdue reckoning with the many festering systemic racial disparities and injustices in our country. The law, in its many facets, both criminal and civil, is front and center now in terms of both the problem and the solution. To this point, the law has let us down, and the path forward is going to have to involve substantial legal change at both the doctrinal and the institutional level. It is long past time for us to find and follow that path forward. Our society cannot afford to wait any longer. And these are, of course, extraordinary times in another respect as well. The global pandemic has forced our law school to move online. We cannot gather together in person to talk about these fundamentally important matters in the hallways, at the lunch table, in organizational meetings, and the like. We've been forced apart at precisely the moment when we need to find a way to come together. This discussion series is designed to help bring us all together, students and faculty alike, to begin as a law school community and as agents of legal change to confront the issues of racial injustice that plague our nation. It's beyond frustrating that we cannot gather in person, but that doesn't mean we can't gather at all. We can gather here online. We can still be in the Zoom where it happens. You've all seen the series schedule. I'm not going to go through it in detail here. I will just note that over the rest of the fall semester, there will be three more events, each featuring the nation's leading experts, discussing the role of race and the path forward in commercial law, in civil law, in criminal law, rather, in civil justice. And we begin our series today with a discussion of racial justice and public health. Let me just give you a few logistical ground rules before we get started. Today's event will take the form of an interview of our own Dean Dana Matthew by our own Professor Sonia Suter. The interview will likely last around 45 minutes or so, give or take, and then we're going to open things up for Q&A. I'd like to ask everyone to please keep your microphones muted throughout and your video off as well. If you have questions, please type them into the chat. There's no need to wait for the Q&A to start in order to do that. Once you think of a question, feel free to type it into the chat. Professor Peter Smith, who's my co-chair on the Law School's Intellectual Life Committee, he's going to be monitoring the chat as we go. And when the time is right, he will feed your questions to our presenters. If you're watching this on the YouTube live stream, you can still send questions to Professor Smith. Just do so by email. He'll be monitoring his email as well. His email address is pjsmith, not psmith, but pjsmith at law.gwu.edu. So without any further ado, let me turn things over to Professor Sonia Suter, one of the nation's leading experts on genetics and bioethics and health law, who's going to serve as our interviewer this afternoon. So Professor Suter.
Thank you, Professor Colby. It gives me great pleasure to be conducting this interview today and also to introduce our new dean, Dean Dana Matthew, who joins our community with the perfect set of skills for this moment, with a PhD in public health and scholarship that addresses racial justice and health inequities. I think it's important to know a little bit more about our dean. So I'm going to give you information about her background so you understand really how perfectly suited she is for this moment. So she earned her JD at the University of Virginia Law School. And after that, she clerked on the Virginia Supreme Court. She worked as a civil litigator focusing on medical malpractice and insurance defense, and also practiced in the areas of health and commercial litigation. She's taught at numerous schools, both law schools and public health schools. I'll just focus on some of the law schools: University of Colorado School of Law, and most recently, University of Virginia School of Law. In the midst of all of her writing and teaching, she managed to earn a PhD from the University of Colorado, where she wrote a dissertation entitled Medical Legal Partnerships: Disrupting Cumulative Adversity for Vulnerable Colorado Families. If you don't think that's enough to know how accomplished our new dean is, let me tell you more. She also co-founded the Colorado Health Equity Project to form medical legal partnerships that integrate legal services into healthcare delivery. And she co-founded and was director of the Equity Center at the University of Virginia, which is an interdisciplinary center to redress racial and economic inequity by transforming the research mission of universities. She's also served as the senior advisor to the director of the EPA's Office of Civil Rights. And she was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow, where she served on the health policy team for Senator Debbie Stabenow from the state of Michigan, my home state. And finally, she has written widely on various topics in health law, but in particular at the intersection of racial injustice and public health, including her wonderful book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality and American Healthcare, and her forthcoming book, Just Health, A Plan to End Structural Racism and Achieve Health Equity in America. It's worth pointing out also that Dean Matthew is the first woman to lead the law school 100 years after women earned the right to vote. She's also the first Black woman at the helm of the law school, a law school that was established in the nation's capital in 1865 at the time that the Civil War ended in the beginning of Reconstruction. So as you can see, Dean Matthew really has a perfect career for this moment where we are dealing with this global pandemic that has disproportionately ravaged Black and Brown communities, and where we are dealing with deep and long-standing problems of racial injustice. Really couldn't have a better pedigree. So with that background, let's sort of jump in. And my plan for today was to start by asking you about your work and how you highlight the connection between racial injustice and public health, and to show how racial discrimination leads to health disparities. It's a sad story that you'll be telling us, but I'd also like to spend some time for you telling us a little bit about the solutions, and then talking a little bit about the projects that you have led and the plans you have for some very exciting work at GW. So let's start by setting up the issues. Your work involves trying to understand associations between social factors, racism in particular, and health incomes and health inequities. And you have the tools of public health training to help you do that. So can you tell us sort of generally about how data can be analyzed to understand and measure inequities among populations and groups?
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Sonia. The key to answering your question lies in a term called the social determinants of health. But before I get to that, may I just pause and say thank you to you, Sonia, for that very generous introduction. I cannot believe you found the title of my dissertation. I have it buried in a hole in my backyard right now. And I also want to thank Tom Colby and Peter Smith and all of my colleagues who worked hard at this very important series, which I am really proud that our university, our law school, is putting on. So then to return to your question, my work connects racial discrimination and public health disparities. The connection between them, specifically going to your question about data, is evidence-driven. And the reason I start by saying that social determinants are the key to that link and the key to that connection is because of recent learning that empirically teaches us that the majority of the determination for how healthy a person is has not very much at all to do with their genetic or biological history, and not very much at all even to do with their access to clinical care, but is primarily, some would say, 30 to 40% in two other categories. One, the environmental and social risk factors that a person is exposed to, and two, their health behaviors. Now, both of these are influenced by inequality in the United States. So when we think about 40% of one's health being determined by where you live, where you go to school, what access to food you have, your exposure to pollution, the availability of healthcare or recreational spaces. These that I have listed are called social determinants of health. Think about each one of them. They are organized, distributed, and maldistributed by law, right? So we think about housing and its connection to health. Well, the empirical data tell us that there are several housing conditions, mold, lead paint, structural insufficiencies, even density of population, several housing conditions that are considered defects and that are associated with poor health harms. Where are those concentrated? Because of discrimination and residential segregation, historically, they're concentrated in marginalized communities, poor, immigrant, Black, brown communities. And you can go down each one of the social determinants of health that data tell us are empirically associated with health outcomes, right? There's something called the social gradient that connects educational attainment to health outcomes. People who are better educated are more healthy. People who have less education are less healthy. Well, then again, you look at the way that law organizes education as a social determinant of health, and you find that an overwhelming disproportionality of Black, brown, poor, immigrant populations are exposed to poor and low quality education, and therefore suffer poor health. Now, I'll end by saying something that is empirical, to translate that empirical story into common sense. You're right, Sonia, it is a very sad story. But if you're walking along the beach, and I love beaches, and you come upon one dead fish on the beach, you think, oh my God, poor fish, something happened to that fish, right? If you're walking along the same beach and you see hundreds, maybe thousands of dead fish on that beach, the repetition of this kind of death, of this kind of adverse outcome, leads you to inquire about whether there's something wrong with the water, not the fish, right? And so the empirical data that we're looking at, somebody in the audience is going to tell me it's correlative and associative, not causal. And what I want to tell you about that is that there are too many dead fish on the beach not to infer causality.
So can you sort of expand a little bit on this idea of the work, living, play, and educational environments, and how that's played out in the pandemic? Because the pandemic is sort of an illustration of this enduring problem, and it's sort of very much in our minds right now. So can you connect some of those dots with respect to the pandemic?
Sure. The pandemic is a perfect storm that highlights inequalities, structural inequalities in the real-time environment that we're in. But make no mistake about it, these inequalities predated the pandemic, and the pandemic simply gives us an expression of that. So if you think about our community locally, the DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia community, this is a terrible pandemic. We're up to 180,000 deaths. But let's look at the data here in the Washington, D.C. area. We're in phase 2 of the recovery. We're doing relatively well. But although African Americans constitute only 30% of the population here in Washington, D.C., they represent 80% of the confirmed cases, right? In Maryland, although African Americans represent only 30% of the population, they represent 50% of the confirmed cases and death. And in Virginia, it's the Latinx population that, although they represent only 11% of the population, 10 to 11% of the population, they are 45% of the cases, over 30% of the hospitalizations, and 12% of the death, right? These are evidence that this disease has not struck communities equally. Now, I'm involved in a lot of discussions with public health providers, with analysts looking to get ahead of the question of how we're going to distribute a vaccine when it is developed. And so we're thinking about these inequalities, these structural evidences of how race and ethnicity are tied. And one thing I want to be clear as a bell about, it is not enough to say that these populations have disproportionate exposure to underlying comorbid conditions. That's not enough, right? The fact that these populations have disproportionate exposure to diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and other conditions that predispose them, making them more vulnerable to coronavirus, is further evidence of the inequality and disparity that we should not be tolerative of even before the pandemic.
Right. And then of course the housing problems means that they can't engage in behaviors that allow the kind of social distancing. The living in communities with exposure to pollution highlights the, I mean, so it's sort of all working together, these structural systems that are rooted in racism. I think one other important point to think about is that these structural injustices affect work, education, housing, environment, but also that racism itself causes poor health outcomes. So not just that racial injustice leads to these disparities in housing, but you point to some interesting research that racism itself is harmful to individuals, to minorities. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the really interesting thing about racism being harmful in the data that we have is twofold. One, it is a way to underscore the fallacy of the biological concept of race, right? We must not biologize race, right? When we see these correlations, they are not the result of your racial status qua race. It's not race qua race. It is the social milieu that accompanies and that influences one because of one's race that makes these correlations so poignant. But here is the irony, and it's a very sad one. Racism, and we can measure it a number of ways. I'll cite a couple of studies in a moment. Racism is bad for Black and white health. Right? So racism, when we measure it, has a different impact. It's not equal, but it has an adverse health impact on both the perpetrator of racism and on the recipient of racism. So if I could go on for just a minute, let me first define racism, and especially structural racism, because it's very important to distinguish what I am speaking about from individual prejudice or bigotry or even biases, which was the subject of my first book, right? So structural racism is a system. It's an institutionalization of hierarchical arrangements in society that do two things, that performs two functions. Racism is a system that performs two functions. Number one, it arranges people in a hierarchy based on their relative value, right? By race, by ethnicity. So it says this racial group is of greater value and this racial group is of lesser value. That systemic organization of a hierarchy is one of the first two things that racism does. The second important thing for a health standpoint is that racism allocates the resources, the opportunity, and the power in a societal structure along those hierarchies, right? So that's what structural racism is. That's what racism does. How do you measure it? Different scholars have done different things. I'm in the middle of a project. I'm PI of a project that I'm going to have to hand off. I'll tell you about that last right now. But here are some examples. David Che, a really important researcher that looks at racism and its correlation to public health, has one of the most innovative measures. It is to count the number of racial epithets that appear in internet searches, in Twitter conversations. So you can scrape Twitter data, you can scrape Google data, and locate those geographically, the frequency of how many times you search for this epithet or that epithet, right, in a county, in a state, and then cross-tabulate those differences in racial searches on the internet with outcomes like heart disease and stroke and diabetes. High correlation, right? Another way, Project Implicit, which I'm sure is familiar to many people, measures implicit racial bias and explicit racial bias, right? By now, millions of people have taken this test. It has some flaws. We can talk about those in the Q&A if people are interested, but we see Luchacco and others correlate with thousands, over 33,000 patients, infant mortality gaps between Blacks and whites. When we see a correlation between the incidence or the scores of Project Implicit bias, explicit bias, and these health outcomes, then we know that we have some measures of racism, and they are correlated to, associated with adverse outcomes and disparities in health. I'll tell you about the third that I'm working on. One of the things that distinguishes the measure or metric of racism, structural racism, that we are working on, a team and I are working on, is that we have sought to include legal, historical approaches to race as a component of an index in several domains that would measure racism. So I'm going to take Charlottesville for an example because we have great data on Charlottesville, right? So in 1910 in Charlottesville, a segregation ordinance was passed. Before this, mind you, we had no racial segregation between obviously the Civil War, after the Civil War, and 1910. So this statute is passed and it says from now on, you Black people live over there, you white people live over there. And people literally, if you look at the historical oral record, people had to move. They had to move in order to obey the ordinance, right? Once you look at the density of those kinds of laws from 1900 and we go to 1980, so the density of Jim Crow laws, Black laws, pig laws, vagrancy laws, right, that are expressly and explicitly directed at separating hierarchically one race from another, and you put those in each state, right? We can create an index that measures the relative commitment to racially discriminatory laws during a period. We can look at the trajectory, that is to say, how long did those laws last before repeal, and apply an index to that commitment, if you will. We can look at who was an early adopter versus who was a late adopter of a certain category and correlate those to race. And we're looking at doing that and correlating it with other inequalities. I could go on about that. That's one of my favorite projects. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's fascinating because that ties to some of the data that you talk about in Just Health, where you show the kind of ebbs and flows of equal protection. Sort of, we have this clause in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, right, that offers in its language this great promise. And you show that it, has at times provided some kind of equality measure, and then it's pulled back and it's gone back, up and down and up and down. And you sort of track the numbers of differences in rates of infant mortality and death rates among Blacks and whites, and sort of show how that tracks that. And I think that's really fascinating to try to connect what's happening legally with health measures.
Yeah, I have to confess that what I was able to say from the data that I was able to collect was less than I wanted to say, right? Sometimes you have a query and you go to the data and it just doesn't, I don't have the granularity of the data that I wanted to do. I really wanted to see if I could do a time based analysis of whether one of the 5 epochs in which I divided the history of the Equal Protection Clause really did correlate, but it requires more sophisticated difference analysis and Poisson analysis than I was able to do in the time that it took me to write that chapter. But I will say this, what we can see over time is 2 things. Although the trends in absolute numbers have declined, that is, the number of infant mortalities over the past 100 years has declined for both Black and white populations, right? So better healthcare benefits us all. The fact that we have better housing and better living situations than our colonial predecessors benefits us all. But the difference, the gap between Black and white infant mortality and Black and white all-cause mortality has not changed significantly over 100 years, which to me is a very sad commentary. Now, I think there is a silver lining here. I don't want to be Debbie Downer. There's plenty of down, depressing news right now. Well, I can't help it. It's down. But I have some ideas about how to turn the corner. But let me be clear. whatever progress we have made has inured to whites more than it has inured to blacks. It is inured to whites more than it is inured to the health of Native Americans. It is inured to whites more than it is inured to non-white immigrants. And it is also socioeconomically gradiated, right? So that we can say by the data that I showed in chapter 4. Here's the silver lining. If the thesis of my book is correct, then law has a corrective effect. A possible intervention would be to change the legal structures that have sustained structural racism, right? Because remember my definition, I said it is historically a system that organizes and ranks people in institutions. Racism operates in housing, it operates in education. And once it operates in housing and education, frankly, it need not operate anywhere else. It does, but we organize ourselves around all of the resources because we remain a largely residentially segregated society. Once we do that, right, by law, then we really have set in motion the systemic infrastructure, the scaffolding that needs very little other intervention. So then it is also my theory that we can reverse those laws, that we can reverse the failure to live up to the promise that all men are created equal. All men, all women, all humans are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We have never lived up to that promise of our founding documents. We have never lived up to the promise of the Equal Protection Clause. And this gives me hope, because now I have a lever.
Right. So yeah, I think this is maybe a good moment to start talking a little bit more about those solutions. I mean, I just want to add the other piece that your book, Just Medicine, talks about another factor, which are the implicit biases that physicians hold that have an impact on health outcomes, right? So we have the structural piece, then we have the implicit biases. And so, you know, your words, just health or unjust health, they're kind of a reflection of unjust health is what's happening now because our laws are not just. And presumably when we can shape the law in more effective ways, we can move towards just health. So what are ways that we can use the law as a positive tool, either to address these broader structural inequities or to address the implicit biases that play a role in all levels of society, but also particularly in healthcare, the delivery of healthcare?
So thank you for the question. I think I'm gonna respond at sort of a 35,000-foot level, because I want to be clear that changing the law is not going to magically change health disparities or racial discrimination, or it won't make the effects of structural racism disappear overnight. We have lots of good history that tell us once we change the law, then we have to change hearts and minds, right? So what I rely upon the law to do is to signal with its expressive value a change in social norms, right? I rely, secondly, not only on the expressive value of law, but I allow on the exemplary cases that could be brought, right? To create new incentives for people to order their private affairs differently if we were to change the law. Now, I am buoyed in my hope that this will work, because as we have abandoned our commitment to the equal protection laws, the evidence that I show in the book is that the reverse has happened, right? So that immediately after the Civil War, during the 12-year period that we call the first Reconstruction in the United States, when we took seriously the Civil Rights Act of 1866, of 1870, 1875, those statutes that attempted to implement the promise of the Equal Protection Clause from the 14th Amendment. During that period of time, we not only saw equality begin to permeate through all of what I have called the social determinants of health, but we also saw narrowing in the health gaps to the extent that we are able to collect some of that data, it's not totally reliable, so I don't quote it in the book, between Blacks and whites. We don't have any data on Native Americans. We don't have any data at a granular level that makes it reliable. But I do believe that I am able to show that across the arc of history, right, during the entirety of the Equal Protection Clause and its effect, that there have been periods of time in which we have enforced and then retreated, enforced and then retreated. The best data that I have is from Charlottesville again, and this is where I started the research with respect to the book. Right? And I did use Poisson analysis there, regression analysis there, to look at infant mortality during the 5 epochs that are presented in Just Health, right? This is an article called On Charlottesville, right? And what you see is that between 1995 and 2000, taking infant mortality first, Black infant mortality was actually lower than white infant mortality during that entire period. When did it reverse? Now, it reversed in 2001 when Alexander versus Sandoval, one of my least favorite decisions from the Supreme Court ever, right? And I cannot say, so you do not hear me to say, please don't hear me to be quoted to say that the moment the Supreme Court made the mistake that it made in Alexander versus Sandoval, infant mortality reversed. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I am again saying that there's something to this expressive value of law. As we slowly departed from the notion, right, of the Civil Rights Acts that were lofty, that were committed to what I would call a Rawlsian perspective of justice, justice as fairness, right? Justice as equality of opportunity. That's the Rawlsian dream that I believe the history, the legislative history tells us was intended, was fought over in order to enact the 14th Amendment. As we progressively departed from that, our health also declined and our health gaps also widened. So that's my thesis.
Do you want to tell, for especially for our students, a little bit why you have such problems with Sandoval and how you see the sort of pulling back from the protections of the Equal Protection Clause, both with respect to disparate impact, private right of action?
Yes, I will. Let me just, if I may finish, I didn't answer your question completely. I didn't say, what can we do? In a nutshell, what we need to do is return to a full-fledged and full-throated enforcement of the Equal Protection Act, right? The Equal Protection Amendment, clause of the 14th Amendment, excuse me. And I have, all kinds of things that have flowed from that overarching recommendation. We could do a much better job of enforcing the Fair Housing Act. We should reinstate the political powers that were assigned and provided from the Voting Rights Act. Our decision to depart from the definition of equality in enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. All of these are mistakes of law, in my view. And these corrected would change the expressive value of law, would change the legal environment in which we operated and therefore produce better health outcomes. So going to Alexander versus Sandoval, the mistake in that decision was to undo the history, the precedent of providing private causes of action for disparate impact cases. This is a category of case that allows a litigant to look at all the dead fish on the beach and gather data that explain the correlation between those dead fish and a pattern and practice of discrimination, find that disparate impact without evidence of a discriminatory intent. Right? So I don't have to find that the person was malicious, was evil, was bigoted, was an individual, what we call racist, right? I don't have to find that. I can look at the dead fish and I can say, whatever the motivation, whatever the incentives, whatever the mindset, the impact here is one that is racist, right? And I can actionably, and I have a colorable cause of claim. That ended with Sandoval, in which the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia writing for the Supreme Court, decided that the private cause of action was not intended by the the legislative drafters of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Instead, it was only their intent to allow disparate impact cases to be brought administratively, and the remaining private cause of action that is available to change social norms, to address and create incentives against discrimination is only the hardest kind of case to bring, one that's virtually impossible to prove, and that is an intent case, a disparate treatment case under Title VI. So that's what Sandoval did.
So your project, your long range project, is to use the law to affect the social norms. Yes. And to sort of upend the structural inequities rooted in racism. But you also talk about, there's a lot of feedback mechanisms in much of what you talk about, right? Implicit biases of healthcare providers affect how patients react, and that sort of feeds back. And the laws affect social norms, but of course, social norms also influence the laws. And so this is probably the hardest question that I'm going to ask you, which is, how do we make that happen when we keep seeing this history of we sort of give more protections or give more strength to the Equal Protection Clause, and then there's almost a backlash, right? A pulling back, like, oh my God, that was too much. We gave away too much. And the clash against rights and the idea of equality of opportunity may mean allowing people a little bit of extra. And so we're a very rights-based society. Is this infringing on my liberty? So how do we deal with social norms that push against the law changing, right? We need the two working together. And that's a big, hard question.
Yeah, it is a big, hard question. I think I'm going to answer it a little unfairly in this way. What you're hitting on is one of the things of many that attracted me to George Washington University Law School, quite frankly. I am here in no small part because this is a legal community that does the hard work of answering hard questions, right? And you mentioned in our history, there is the founding of this university in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. Who puts a law school in the middle of the Capitol at the end of the Civil War, right? Except somebody who's willing to take on the challenge of training civil leaders, civil servants, to have these hard questions and wrestle them. You look at our faculty, how many of our faculty are not only excellent in the classroom, but have experiences at the Department of Justice, leading the International Trade Commission, are writing on and arguing multiple cases in the Supreme Court, in federal court. This is a faculty uniquely engaged in the wrestling and the hard work of answering hard questions. It is not easy. I don't have an easy answer, but I'm in the right pond.
Right. I mean, and it is a hard question. And I think part of what you're trying to do is help us understand why it matters, right? To give an argument for why we should care. Even back to your point that you made earlier, it hurts us all, right? I mean, obviously we should care about equality in its own right, and we should believe that everybody should be treated equally, but we're all hurting as a society with this problem. So I think just to make sure that we have time for people's questions, I'd like to turn a little bit to your project. So if you could tell us a little bit about the Health Equity Project and the Equity Center at UVA, and then I want to leave you time to talk about your big plans for an Equity Institute at GW.
Yes, all of those were precursors to, and I hope the grand finale will be the Equity Institute that I've proposed here at George Washington University Law School. So the Colorado Health Equity Project was an incubator for medical legal partnerships, right? It grows out of my belief, again, that the law is a driver of health problems, that the law is an obstacle to and a barrier to achieving health in individuals' lives, right? The paradigmatic case would be of a young child with asthma. You send that young child to the doctor gives that child a nebulizer treatment and gives them a inhaler to take home, right? But if that child goes home to an apartment that's pest infested, moldy, that has allergens in the carpets, the albuterol has not a chance in Hades, to heal that child, what I have to do in the Colorado Health Equity Project is combine the delivery of legal services with the delivery of healthcare in the same clinical settings. It's magic. The people whose lives we changed, it was like shooting fish in a barrel, because we won so often. You'd win no matter. One year we focused on immigration cases. Anybody we could adjust, we could get access to healthcare. Another year we focused on mental health and mental illness cases, and we were able to get treatment. So that was the Colorado Health Equity Project. The problem is we did 10, 8, 12 cases a year, and I was looking for larger solutions. So fast forward to the University of Virginia, we founded something called the Center for the Redress of Racial and Socioeconomic Inequity through Community Engaged Scholarship. This was a center that was cross-disciplinary. There were 7 different colleges of the university represented in our leadership, and it focused on something that is called Community Engaged Scholarship for a very important reason. CBPR, or other names depending on the field, describes a scholarly approach that allows community members rather than scholars to define and identify the questions asked and answered by the researcher, number 1. Number 2, it considers the expertise of a community member as a participant in the research project, right? So I don't just show up at your house, knock on the door with a survey and ask you to answer it and walk away. Right? You are a co-researcher as a member of the community because you have expertise. This is community engaged scholarship. And the third characteristic is that that research leaves something beneficial behind. So I do that research not just to promote my tenure case or to advance my publications. I do that research to actually benefit the community that I'm dependent upon for that research. And that's the organizing feature of the Equity Center that is still operative at the University of Virginia. And I will tell you that during the COVID crisis, that combination of research expertise at a resource-rich institution and the community address of the COVID crisis has been astounding. It's been remarkable. So they've done a lot of things to bring the resources of the medical school to accelerate testing in the community and so forth. So that was the Equity Center at UVA. So all of my learning from those 2 projects has led me to talk with my colleagues at the law school. And one of the things that's wonderful about the Equity Institute proposal that we have from the law school is that, again, the phrase comes to me like shooting fish in a barrel. All I have to do is package the excellent work that's already going on here, right? So we have come up with 6 pilot projects. Some of it is all I'm doing is saying, let's put it under this rubric of an equity institute that is dedicated to bringing the resources of a Research One institution to the problems of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic inequality in America, right? So let's bring those resources together to bear. It's the purpose of a fine university of higher education. And here at the law school, we have Don Brayman working on data science for improving prosecutorial decision-making. We have Lisa Fairfax working on business finance, equity, and literacy, especially among young women and girls. We have Roger Fairfax working on criminal justice equity. We have Sonia and Dana working on health justice, right? All we have here is established, nationally renowned scholars who are doing social justice work already. But here's the catch. That kind of work is proceeding across the GW campus as well. But we hope through this institute to bring the law and policy lens to that work across the campus. So we have a world-renowned School of Public Health. They have a small department on health policy. We would partner with them to bring health law and policy to their inquiries and their work. Same with the School of Engineering, the School of Medicine, the School of Nursing, School of Education, the School of Business. And so this institute would be a cross-disciplinary effort to collect the resources of instruction, curriculum for students, and of research on social justice issues regarding race and socioeconomic status across the campus, bringing the lens of law and policy to bear on each.
And would you see this institute as also having some of the same focus as the institute you set up in Virginia, where there's the community engagement, which to me really has such a strong element of strengthening democracy, right? Because it means community members are really part of shaping policy, and scholarship then becomes part. I mean, it's always related to policy, but you're bringing the community in a really interactive way, kind of more like democratic deliberation almost.
So I am definitely and very excited about making sure that that is a component. As I said, my learning from the University of Colorado's Equity Project and the University of Virginia Equity Center is that my vision here is bigger. So I'm very interested and excited to embrace community engaged scholarship. And the way I've phrased it in this proposal is high impact research and scholarship. So it could be because it is community engaged, yeah, or it could be, think about Alfreda Robinson and her work on gender and race, right? Even though it doesn't fit the CBPR community engagement model, she is having an impact on the representation of women lawyers in the bar and women lawyers in positions of leadership in C-suites in large firms. This is high impact research, and I'd like to embrace both in this institute.
Well, very, very exciting. We are at the 1 o'clock point, so I'm going to let our listeners ask questions. And the first question is from Cody McEnny Ingram. Have you noticed a difference in the response of state local systems to COVID towards Black, brown, poor immigrant communities? Do you think some of these responses have helped or hurt them more than others?
Yes and yes. And one of the things that we are suffering from is the really poor data collection on the COVID crisis. One of the things we wanted to do with our racism metric was to test it on state by state. And we were hoping county by county preliminary COVID data. It's incomplete and it's poor data. If you can't measure it, you can't see it, you can't fix it. So this is a very serious problem. But what we are seeing, and I can say anecdotally, what we are seeing is that the availability of tests varies from state to state. The availability of access to care varies from state to state. But the thing that varies most is the social determinants of health, right? So the proportion of essential workers, what a nice name for saying you get the privilege of being exposed disproportionately to a deadly pandemic so that the rest of society can shelter in place, right? So 30% of the people who stock our grocery shelves are African-American, Latinx populations, right? We, before the pandemic, were asking people who are undocumented to harvest our avocados, our citrus fruits. And we did that hoping that our dissonance with respect to their immigration status was acceptable enough to them to remain in the country long enough to make sure that we had food to eat. The minute that the pandemic hit, in many states, including California, we issued them a designation as essential workers and told them they had to appear at work, right? So 30% of those bus drivers who are still traveling back and forth in Washington, D.C. are African American. And so this disproportionality is evident at the state and local level as well from a structural perspective, as well as an individual perspective.
And we make them essential, but we don't pay them accordingly, right? So that they have to take the bus and they can't have their own car and they can't escape all the other social factors that influence health. Okay, our second question is from Ashra Ramakumar, and it's in part about implicit bias. How does the erosion of programs like Medicaid contribute to / exacerbate these disparities? Do you feel that the addition of components like work requirements are motivated by implicit racial bias? It's a good question.
I try not to answer empirical questions without empirical data. So I can't answer the second question about the motivation of work requirements and other qualifications to the Medicaid program. I can't answer the first, because I just don't have the data, but I can answer the first question. Medicaid is a program that's flawed. There's no question that it's flawed. One of the chief flaws is its very insufficient reimbursement rates for the population and the work that it does. However, it does create access to healthcare for the most vulnerable populations that are also coincidentally suffering the most severe health disparities, right? So we have very good data that shows us that expansion states, Medicaid expansion states, are not only experiencing an increase in coverage, which results in an increase of the access of vulnerable populations to care, but also a statistically significant decrease in some of the disparities that are measuring the difference between Black, white, and Latinx populations outcomes. We have terrible data on Native Americans. We have almost no data on Native Americans, right? So there is this good news, bad news proposition. It's a flawed program. It's the reimbursement rates are poor. The coverage rates are poor, right? But it is a hope. It provides a hope, right? So we can perhaps legislatively, through policy and legal advocacy, expand the definition of what is medically necessary care, right? So housing could be also medically necessary if we become convinced, as the data would suggest, that the quality of housing is as impactful as giving someone access, in my hypothetical, to albuterol.
And you've talked a little bit about using the Medicaid waivers for experimentation to sort
Yes.
of do those sorts of things. Of course, it can also lead to the work requirements, which I think there may not be clear data, but there's the possibility that they're motivated by implicit bias. I think one could make that an interesting thesis to investigate.
So can I interrupt you just for a second, because I want to be fair, and I know where the surmise comes. But when I think about justice, I wrote a piece recently. I can't remember where it came out, but about the different conceptualizations of justice. You notice that I assert that the Equal Protection Clause was motivated, the drafters were motivated by a Rawlsian view of justice, right? Someone could argue that a libertarian view of justice, right? That it is just for us not to impose our needs on others, right? That personal responsibility is just. Someone could argue that the work requirements serve that envisioning of justice and suggest that it's not implicit bias, it's just a commitment as fierce as mine is to the Rawlsian distributive notion of justice, to the distributive fairness notion of justice, but just to a different conceptualization of justice. I want to just say that's a possible theory.
That is a fair point. I mean, that's sort of at the heart of which conception of justice do you hold influences whether you think there should be healthcare provided to everybody or whether we get it on our own, right? I mean, that undergirds all of this. So our third question is from Patrick Walter. What is the most effective and efficient way to distribute good education equitably? Are certain ages of intervention more effective than others?
Yes, early childhood education is really the place to start, and we have lots of data that tells us that. The most effective way to distribute education fairly, I'll go from the large to the smaller solutions, is to defeat residential segregation. And believe it or not, that is not a goal that is unreachable, right? The second way is to untether the financing of education from property taxes that are reflective of the social and economic inequality that is reflected in our segregation system. That's a second way. But as we're going toward those larger solutions, both of which, let me say, are without any question, they are reachable, right? So I stopped short in Just Health and I may yet add this, of some of the examples of jurisdictions that are really aggressively looking at using tax laws, zoning laws, and other incentives to change the landscape so that residential segregation is defeated. But as we're moving towards this, we could look at smaller things that are highly discriminatory in schools. A couple of things. One, disciplinary disparities in school begin at age 3, right? We begin to see a disparity in the assignment of suspensions and other removals of children for disciplinary reasons by race and by gender, Black boys and girls being the worst affected, starting at age 3, right? This is what we mean by the school to prison pipeline. If we could begin to change those approaches to discipline so that the number of multiples of time that an African American, a Native American, and a Latinx American will be subjected to expulsion from school and therefore shuttered into the school to prison pipeline, we would go a long way toward, again, untethering the link between low educational attainment and low health outcomes, health disparities. We could also, secondly, look at the very clear racial and socioeconomic disparities in quality of school, right? So if you look at which schools have access to all of the STEM courses that are required to be prepared to apply to college, right? Or college counseling, right? Or which schools, public schools, middle and high school, have access to AP, IB, and other accelerated courses. They fall along a racial divide. So secondly, quality is something that we could equalize by equalizing school funding. But a third thing to watch out for, and this we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, the school districts were not segregated. They were unitary, to use the word of the law, right? But they were segregated inside of the walls of the school, right? So the assignment of Black and brown children into special ed courses or to not high school diploma, but high school certificate courses, right? The access, of course, accelerated courses for talented and gifted students was distinct along a racial divide within the school building. And we see this with respect to tracking, one of the most contentious educational problems. Attacking tracking, number one, school quality disparities, number two, and school discipline disparities are shorter steps that we could take while we're on our way to defeating residential segregation.
Yeah, huge problem. There's a wonderful podcast, Nice White Parents, that deals with the efforts to handle that and how insidious this problem is. But there's sort of a little bit of a happy ending in that podcast. I recommend it. Next question, how can the law help in cases like that of Shaylon Irving's, a well-to-do Black woman who had 2 PhDs and an amazing insurance plan, who also worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, but was still allowed to die because her clear signs of preeclampsia were ignored for something like 2 weeks. Her case is not rare for Black mothers in America. What can be done to gender healthcare equality, healthcare access equality, so that an American can walk into any hospital and receive up-to-date 2020 medical care?
Yeah, great question. I think the answer is we change the incentives of the organizations, right? So the implicit bias literature is rich, it's copious, it gives us a lot of hope, but here's the problem. And I hope this is not news to anybody, because if it is, it's like telling people that Santa Claus doesn't exist. Implicit bias training really doesn't change individuals' implicit biases all that much. And if it does, it doesn't change it for long. So what we need to use that learning from implicit bias for is to change institutions. And that's what would change the outcome for this mom with preeclampsia, right? The maternal mortality disparities are horrific and they're widening, right? We're going in the exact opposite direction than we would like to see the data go when we look at the maternal mortality, the death of mothers within the first year of giving birth associated with childbirth who are Black, white, and Latinx are getting wider than they were 25 years ago. So they're about 3.5 times higher for Black women than they are for white women. The way we change those, I think, is to change the law to create different incentives for organizations. And that's why one of the proposals I have for revising Title VI as a litigation tool is not just to recreate or return, not recreate, but return the private cause of action that Alexander Sandoval mistakenly eliminated, but also to add a colorable claim based on a reasonableness standard for failure to organizationally address the disparate impact of implicit or unconscious bias. What would that do? That would give a healthcare provider, whether it's a hospital or a health system, the incentive to take the steps that the data tell us do work to reduce implicit bias, rather than doing trainings and checking off the box and telling everybody that they have to take an IAT, the implicit association test. The structures of how people are assigned, how they are hired would diversify the workforce. These are things that do make a lasting difference to reduce the kinds of biases that resulted in this mom's preeclampsia and death. These are differences that change the way that organizations reward the performance that results in the way that people communicate with one another, right? Results in the way that people interpret ostensibly objective medical data. All of these could be organizationally structured. And what's the proof? Well, it's an anecdotal story with some evidence behind it. Years ago, 1972 is the year that I recall. I think I'm right about this. The symphonic music industry decided to change the organizational structure and processes that led to women getting a dramatically lower number of seats in symphonic orchestras. So they changed the system. They didn't go for the heart and the mind of the judges, right? They didn't tell them to take implicit bias training and tests, but instead they put up a curtain that shielded the judges from the performer. They carpeted floors so that if the performer wore heels, you would not hear it. They blinded CVs and resumes so that names would not give away gender. Changing the processes accounts for and accommodates the fact that we all have implicit biases. And this is the kind of institutional change that could help that mom and I think could reduce health disparities.
And just a point, it's implicit in much of what you said, but I think it's really worth reiterating. Implicit in this question is the fact that these disparities in maternal mortality rates are not, it's not socioeconomic status, right? I mean, because the rate for a woman, a Black woman who has a college education, her maternal mortality rate is the same as a white woman of a 7th grade education.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Sonia, and that's an important part of the questioner's query because, and we see that in maternal mortality, we also see it in infant mortality, right? So I can be Black, middle-class woman making $50,000 to $75,000 a year with an education that's college or above, right? I still have 2.5 to 3 times more likely than a white woman has of losing my baby in the first year of life in the United States if that white woman has a high school education and lives below the poverty line, right? So what explains that? Something called the weathering hypothesis is what we're working with now, and this is coming full circle for the data that we talked about very early on in our conversation, that the allostatic load, that's a way of quantifying the physiological impacts of racism, whether you are middle class, upper class, or lower class, for a woman of color are going to be higher than they would be for a woman who is white and even poor, right? And so we're seeing that maybe some of the explanation that could help us understand why socioeconomic status and education don't change these disparities.
Yep. Okay, next question is from Anil Taibji. Many of the worst COVID-19 outbreaks and other health outcomes are concentrated in prisons, but discussions to improve equity in public health often ignore the role that racist criminalization plays. How might we include imprisoned populations in how we discuss and research racial and socioeconomic disparities in public health, and how do we ensure that they are not ignored in solutions?
Yeah, it's such an important question. It really is an important question. Early on before I left Virginia, there was a group headed up by the Legal Aid Justice, LAJC, Legal Aid Justice Committee, maybe, I don't know what the C stands for, in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was directly petitioning and filing on behalf of prisoners who were exposed disproportionately to COVID in Virginia. And they got some traction. They got a good deal of traction. I have to say, I didn't help very much. And I feel that's a burden that I have. So we could all do more. The two things that are important, at least these two things are important. And one is to increase the quality of healthcare inside of prisons, the access to testing and treatment, contact tracing, quarantine, and the defense of against the disease inside of prisons. And the other is to change the disproportionate rate at which people of color get incarcerated in the first place, right? So one of the social determinants of health, quite honestly, is the racial disparities that make Black and brown people more susceptible to incarceration for the same behavior and conduct as white people. And the data is very clear. I'll cite a little, and this is another conversation. I think you're going to have a subsequent session in this excellent series that will delve much more deeply into this than I will touch it, but let me just highlight this one data. When we look from 1995 to 2017, the period during which I have data from the Bureau of Crime Statistics, I'm probably misstating the title of that. If somebody's really interested in that data, I'd be happy to show it to them. We have two sets of data that show us the prevalence of use of marijuana between Black and white people year after year. On a bar chart, the prevalence of use is almost identical, right? Black and white people. Is how frequently they use marijuana on a national basis. Next to that data, if you place for the same years how frequently Blacks and whites are arrested for marijuana violations, the disparities are enormous, right? And in Charlottesville, we found that who was getting killed? It was the kids, right? Kids, juvies were getting arrested at wildly disproportionate rates if they were Black and Latinx in Charlottesville versus those who were white using marijuana at the same level, right? So we're not talking about a disparity in criminality. And that's not just true for marijuana, it's true for homicides, it's true for robberies, and we could go on, right? So the disparity in conduct and participation in criminal activity does not explain the disproportionate incidence of incarceration.
Yeah, it's a real problem. Anam Abid, how can we reduce biases in individuals and groups? I agree education is often the key, but many are unwilling to hear factual evidence due to cognitive dissonance. You can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. How can we incentivize these biased groups to drink the water and truly get educated?
Yeah, my response cites HIPAA, right? Because privacy protections and security rules under HIPAA are nobody's favorite, right? And certainly nobody's favorite regulatory oversight. When I was at the University of Virginia the first time, Peter Swire, who was working then for the Clinton administration, was the architect of that like 2,000-page regulatory tome that visited HIPAA on the healthcare industry in order to protect privacy and confidentiality, to basically legislate the ownership of one's medical information and records. The records belong to the provider, but your information belongs to you in the patients. Does everybody love HIPAA? No. But does everybody obey HIPAA? Yes. Why? Because we created a legal and regulatory environment that incentivizes compliance and disincentivizes violations of that, right? I don't need your heart and mind. I don't need you to love HIPAA. I don't need you to love privacy. I don't need you to even love your patient's ownership of their data, but I do need you to obey the law. So I create an infrastructure, right? I require entities to have appointed authorities. I give a set of penalties, frankly, for violating those standards. I regularly require reporting and training, and in exchange, you escape liability. And that is the kind of environment, I think, organizationally, that we could structure to incentivize compliance with, or I should say, recognition and accommodation of the fact that we are all implicit victims of implicit bias. We are all victims of implicit bias. That's one thing. I'll close with this last thing, and I think probably we're out of time after this. But implicit bias, it's important to understand, is ubiquitous, right? And I've told this story a lot, but when I was training for one of the two foolish marathons that I will never do it again. But I was training for the Marine Corps Marathon, and I took a lift one morning, or I called for a lift to go to the Iwo Jima Memorial, which is, as you know, in Arlington, and that's where we would start our runs. It was a morning that I had an 18-mile run. I remember this very clearly. The driver who picked me up didn't see me until I was in the back seat of his car, right? It was kind of early in the morning. I went around the back of the car and I entered from the back. I sat down, and as soon as he saw me, he turned around and he looked and he goes, "Oh, I'm not going to Virginia. I've been driving all night and I don't want to go. Get out." Well, it wasn't the "I'm not going" part. It was the insistence that I get out that made me think immediately that it was my race that was making him treat me like this, right? My bias, my implicit bias, was to interpret that. He didn't say the N-word. He didn't say anything untoward toward me about my race. But he did a number of things that convinced me in my gut that this was racism, right? So that's my presumption. Fast forward, I finally did get out of his car. I'm making it much shorter because I think we're out of time. I couldn't think of anything to do that day. So I walked around as I got out and I opened all 4 of his doors. It's ridiculous. It has absolutely no, I don't know what it was supposed to do, but that's what I did. That was a Saturday, did my run, got another cab, did my run. Sunday, I'm out of sorts. Monday, I get up and I'm in another lift and I'm still pretty upset about this. And so I asked the Lyft driver, "Is there anything I can do?" You can tell this is an old story, because I was given the dispatcher emergency number. I called the Lyft dispatcher, and here's the point of the story. That person answered the phone and said, "Lyft emergency, Lyft dispatcher, what is your emergency?" But here's the point. They answered the phone with a very deep Southern, not just Southern, Virginia drawl. It was a Virginia accent, excuse me. My immediate presumption was that this was going to get worse than it was going to get before it was going to get better. This person is not going to understand. They're not going to get it. I'm going to get embarrassed. So I'm stumbling over my story. I'm trying to explain what happened. The guy was mean to me. I don't know if it was racism. He didn't, and I'm trying to tell the story. I'm doing a very poor job. And here is what happened. That dispatcher said to me, "Ma'am, stop right there. That is an emergency. And I will stay on this phone for as long as you need me to stay in order to figure out a way to make that right." Well, not only did I delete the Uber app from my phone, but Lyft, I would give them my first, I'd give them my firstborn. Here's the point. I was as implicitly biased as I accuse the driver of being. Why? Because all of my social stored knowledge told me to make assumptions about that Southern accent that were not true. And so the other thing that we could do to the question of the last, that was asked by the last person, the other thing we could do is work on de-demonizing implicit bias. It is harmful. It operates in a racist context, but it is also ubiquitous. And we all share it. So as soon as we recognize that, we can begin to have real honest conversation about it that's non-accusatory, non-demonizing, and we can address it.
Well, thank you. One just really quick question before we wrap up is, will students get information about how they could be involved in the Equity Institute once it's formed?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I am looking forward to is creating research, writing, and service opportunities for law students. The difference maker in every one of those organizations that I created, when we made a huge difference in people's lives in Colorado with the Colorado Health Equity Project, it was the students who came out in the middle of January to move a family from a roach-infested trailer park that they got condemned so that they can move someone up on the Section 8 list and get them into, the students made all the difference. Even at the Equity Institute, I wasn't there by the time I was here in DC, but it was the students who did all the volunteer work to get almost universal testing in one part of the low-income minority neighborhoods in Charlottesville. So yes is the answer. It will not go without students.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks to both of you. We are out of time, but thanks so much. You did such a tremendous, wonderful job. That was, of course, depressing, but it was also uplifting and it was empowering. It's exactly what we were hoping for. So thanks everyone for being here. Remember, there are 3 more of these covering other important areas, and we really hope to see you all there and tell your friends. And thank you all so much. We are done.
Thank you, Sonia. It was great talking.
Thanks. It was great talking to you. Bye-bye.